Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative and creative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in ranch brokerage and land conservation, or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work and has an interesting story to tell. My guests today are Matt Barber and Joel Doub. Matt and Joel are the owners of Tom Morgan Rodsmiths, a Bozeman-based fly rod company known for its unyielding commitment to quality, craftsmanship, and enduring performance. The duo purchased the company in early 2017 from Tom Morgan, a fly fishing legend who, along with his wife Jerry, built the company into one of the world's most unique and renowned rod builders. Rather than focus on the latest fads or selling high volumes of products, Tom was dedicated solely to building the highest quality rod, one that could be passed on from generation to generation, decade after decade. You may be surprised to learn that Matt and Joel are not fly fishing industry veterans. Their previous careers were in education and medical device sales. But when Tom Morgan decided to sell the company, Matt and Joel's passion for fly fishing, their willingness to learn from the best, and their commitment to continuing the company's legacy allowed them to stand out from the crowd of competing buyers. To everyone's dismay, Tom passed away unexpectedly soon after the sale of the company, but only after imparting his wisdom, craftsmanship secrets, and high standards on to Matt and Joel. Building on Tom and Jerry's rock-solid foundation, the company is now entering its next phase, and the future has never looked brighter. Matt and Joel were in Denver for the annual fly fishing show, so we met up to chat about the company and their journey into fly fishing entrepreneurship. We talked at length about Tom and his laser-like focus on quality, and how he was willing to snap a rod in half if it did not meet his high standards. We chatted about the secret to making these rods, which mostly boils down to being able to work harder than anyone else. We talked about Tom's unique partnership with his wife Jerry, and how the couple was able to transfer decades of knowledge and experience to Matt and Joel. We discussed the company's unique business model, and how it flies in the face of most mainstream MBA business theories. And as usual, we discussed favorite books, films, crazy outdoor experiences, and plenty more. This was a very fun conversation. I'm excited to watch the company continue to grow and thrive under Matt and Joel's ownership. Be sure to check out the episode notes for everything we discuss, and follow Tom Morgan Rodsmiths on Instagram and other social media. There's links to everything in the notes. Hope you enjoy. When you guys meet somebody for the first time and they ask you, what do you do? How do you answer that question?
I think luckily with this job, I'm able to say I build custom fly rods.
Yeah.
You know, there's no dancing around it. It's a good answer to be able to have.
Mm-hmm. And so I want to dig into the company. I want to dig into life in Bozeman, all that. But you guys have very unique backgrounds. You weren't born into this business. It's not a family business. You guys came from different careers to do this. So can you talk a little bit about how you ended up doing that?
Yeah, I mean, or background-wise, I was working as the head of a small private middle school for the last 5 years and 17 years there as a teacher. So I really came out of education, and fly fishing is the thing I did when I was feeling stressed, and that's how I got away from things.
Yeah, I think we both grew up fishing.
Yeah.
And I think I stopped fishing kind of in college, just didn't really start fishing, and met Matt through kind of some mutual friends in Denver. And Matt and a friend of ours actually got me fishing again. So we started fishing. When I met Matt, he was only a dry fly fisherman from the East Coast. He wouldn't nymph.
I know that
He
feeling.
wouldn't put anything below the surface of the river. And I think I had kind of had a variety of jobs. I spent the last 13 years in medical device sales with spine surgeons. So kind of different, but I did actually end up doing a lot of education and training in that role as well. So I think Matt and I both kind of come from an education background. And I sort of knew about Tom Morgan just because of his legacy at Winston. Yep. So I'd always fish Winston rods. I always beat up Matt and our other friends. We got to buy a green rod. And, I kind of knew him from that, and knew obliquely from a surgeon customer of ours about Tom Morgan Rodsmiths.
Got it. And so how did you end up acquiring this business? Or I think a better way to go into this is let's talk a little bit about Tom Morgan Rodsmiths, because it's one of the most unique fly fishing companies that I know of.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely a fly fisherman, but I'm not 100% obsessed. But even I know about it and how unique it is. So can you guys just give a little overview about that company before we dig any deeper?
Yeah. So Tom grew up in Ennis, and he grew up, his parents owned the El Western Hotel. And about age 12, he started guiding on Odell Creek, and people from out of state would request this teenager to take him out fishing in Montana. And he just became passionate about fly fishing and owned a tackle shop in Ennis, and decided he was going to purchase Winston. And in 1973, he purchased Winston in San Francisco.
Oh, wow.
So he moved his family out to San Francisco. It's been amazing. We've been out to San Francisco a little bit now that we've owned the company. I guess I didn't realize it was such a fly fishing kind of hotbed. There's a real community of fly fishermen, historic community of fly fishermen there. The Golden Gate Angling Casting Club is just an amazing place. But so Tom owned that, and then he decided to bring it back to Montana. So that's when he moved it to Twin Bridges. Was it 3 years later? And he brought it back to Twin Bridges and ran Winston there and had it till 1991. And so most people, when we talk about Tom Morgan Rodsmiths, we start with Winston because that's a thing that a lot of people have heard of.
Sure.
After that, he kind of was helping out with the transition for David Ondaatje and moving things over for him taking ownership of Winston. And he started developing, symptoms of MS. And he met also his wife Jerry at the same time, and pretty fortuitous that they met around about that same time, and they started discussing ways that as he knew he would start losing use of his legs and then his arms and become confined to a wheelchair, what could they do together for work that would make sense, and the rod building thing was something that made sense to them. So about 20 years ago they built a home shop and started from scratch with Tom's designs. A lot of the designs he'd just been cultivating in his mind, and Jerry, really became the hands that built those rods. So he had to describe a lot of those processes to her. She had never built a rod before.
Wow.
And she wasn't a fisherman. Yeah.
Really?
Yep. And still isn't a fisherman. She's a rod maker.
Really?
Yeah. Yep.
Have you heard many stories from her about how that teaching process went? Because that's seems like that would be extremely hard to teach somebody.
They tell a great story that I think we all could identify with in terms of a relationship to our spouse. But the very first time they were looking for a tool in one of those red tool chests, and he was sitting there and he couldn't get up and go over and get it, and he was telling her about trying to find it, and she'd pull out a drawer and just start pulling out random things.
Every tool. Pick up a tool, walk over to him, wrong tool, put it back. Pick up a tool, walk over to him. And it took a better part of a day, right?
Yeah.
And the day ended with her crying, and they both went to separate ends of the house. And that was just one tool.
Wow.
And, we've learned, we thought making a fly rod wasn't really this compendium of 1,000 steps, but it really is. It's this journey when we make fly rods now and the way Tom did them.
Sure.
And I think we've heard different stories about him and why he left Winston or what happened there, but I think that he wanted a perfect fly rod, and I think he has always wanted a perfect fly rod. That was kind of a journey for him that never really ended. He was always tinkering. He was changing patterns up to just this last year. He was always in this pursuit of making the best thing, and that wasn't the best fly rod. It was every single component and process in making them was refined. Sure. And there was always room in his head to refine it more. He always was thinking, like, we have an oven to coat blanks or bake blanks and cure the resins on them, but what if each blank could spin inside a barrel that was spinning inside an oven with multiple vertical heating elements for each blank? It wasn't just we can get some heat in an oven and cure a blank, which is what most people do. He was thinking, how far can I go? And you can't do that in a high production environment.
No.
And I think that's part of the story of him and Winston was he had a long run there, and I think that's longer than either of us have ever been in a job, so I get that. But he also was constrained by volume and numbers and employees and the realities of running a bigger business. Sure. Didn't allow you to say, is there a better way for us to make this ferrule?
Yeah. Or
can I spend a couple months working on this ferrule design?
Yeah.
You can't in those environments. And I think for Tom, the Tom Morgan Rodsmiths was really about making as close to the perfect rod as you can, regardless of price, regardless of components, regardless of time, regardless of all those things that constrain you in normal production environments.
Yeah, and I want to dig into some of that, the ideas about the business and how it kind of goes against a lot of traditional business practices or business thoughts about how you should run a business. But before that, can you just talk in detail a little bit about the types of rods you guys make and the current customers you have and kind of this loyal cult following that you guys have?
Yeah. So, we make graphite, fiberglass, and bamboo rods. All of our rods are custom. So part of the business model is we don't sell to retail shops. We don't have a big stock, big inventory of rods. Really when you call up and you say, I'd like to buy a rod, we start a conversation. We start talking about what water are you fishing? What kind of flies are you fishing? What rods have you enjoyed in the past? And we start talking about things like what kind of handle do you want on that rod? We talk about the reel seat wood. We get all of our wood from burls, and we shape them down and we turn them on the lathe, and we 6 coats of hand rubbed gunstock oil on each one. Wow. And then you pick the actual specific piece of wood that we put on your rod. So it's a really great process, because I've had people walking through the shop asking us about it. And when I show them, I'll have a piece of green masking tape at my workstation. There's some last names on it and some notes about what kind of, reel seat hardware they want. But I can tell you the name of that person. I can tell you the fact that I texted them a picture last week of where their rod was in progress. I can tell you a little bit about the special occasion for the rod. So it's a really neat connection to something, and as a kind of self-proclaimed gearhead, I own a lot of gear, but it's very few pieces of gear that I could tell you the name of the person who built those skis for me, or the name of the guy that did the welds on my mountain bike. So our rods are all one-off, custom built for each customer. We build 2- and 4-piece graphite rods, and then the bamboo and fiberglass as well.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of goes to Tom's history too. So he was a fishing guide first.
Yeah.
Different people go different ways. Rod designers come from different backgrounds. Some guys are engineers and scientists, mm-hmm. and materials guys who know about resins and epoxies and graphites and things like that. And Tom was really a fisherman first, and he guided and worked with people fishing and watched what they struggled with, and what they did well, how well the tools worked for them. Yep. And I think for him, it made more sense to build rods for people as opposed to building a design and putting that design out in the marketplace and saying, I have this space age super design that's good for everybody. For him, it was more about, this guy can't cast more than 35 feet, so what rod is best for him, and how can I get him in position to catch this trout? It was more of a guide's perspective and a fishing perspective. And I think that Tom picked up the engineering and learned the design and that kind of stuff. Yeah. But he really started as somebody who was worried about and concerned about people being better fishermen.
Sure.
Yeah.
What that reminds me of, a different type of craftsman, is like surfboard shapers. I love to surf, which doesn't really fit in with the whole mountain western stuff. But it's, you hear about these surfboard shapers who, make certain surfboards for a certain person, and they're a certain arm length at a certain break, mm-hmm. For a certain time of year. And they're expensive, but they're the kind of thing that lasts forever, and mm-hmm. there's nothing like them. Yep. So speaking of these rods are made for individuals. None of them have fancy space age names, correct? You go to any fly shop, all the rods nowadays, it's like you're buying a spaceship because the names are so fancy. Yeah. But y'all's are not that at all. Can you talk about that?
Well, and that's really the core of another one of Tom's philosophies was, we're not out to sell you. If you buy a 9'5" weight from us today, 2 years from now, that should be the same great rod. Mm-hmm. Fish don't change, rivers don't change, still fishing similar flies. If it's a great rod, it should last. So I think a little bit of it is that in everything beyond fishing, but we're in this disposable culture, and there's planned obsolescence to everything. So the flashy names really represented a brand new model line. Mm-hmm. And then the new flashy name is going to be 2 years from now what replaces that old model line.
Exactly.
And Tom's philosophy was, if we can tinker with it, if there's a change to be made for the better, we'll do it. But really, if you come back in 10 years and cast our 9'5" weight, it should feel a lot like your 9'5" weight, and we don't want to sell you a new 9'5" weight.
Yeah.
So that's really, it's a philosophical piece that we don't need names, because that's just the one we make, and it's the best one we make, and mm-hmm. we're not going to try to upsell you a new one in a couple of years.
That's really cool and really, really rare in business in general, but even more nowadays. So did he have a trade secret to building these rods? I'm not going to ask you to reveal it if he did. Is there a trade secret, or is the secret that he is 100% committed to quality more than anybody else?
I think it's probably more the latter than the former. I mean, when we started this process of thinking about buying the business and operating it, we talked to a lot of people who gave us some advice about it. Most of them were, "You're crazy. Don't do it." Yeah. So I remember one of the guys asked me, he said, "Why couldn't one of the employees just go make that rod? Mm-hmm. Why couldn't they just quit tomorrow and go make a Tom Morgan rod?" And I didn't have a great answer for him. I mean, the tapers are Tom's tapers, but Tom used to say there are no new tapers. you could take a rod, go buy it, and deconstruct it, measure every part of it, and figure out what the taper of it is. There's not really a secret there that couldn't be copied. But I think you're right. I think we've been pretty surprised the extent to which he would pursue quality, and I think most people are surprised from a component standpoint. It's like I said, it's really the compendium of the parts. The sum is greater than all the parts. And we don't think that there is anybody out there really that's willing to go to that length to create these kind of fly rods. And it's interesting. It's not like there isn't really a secret sauce. I mean, the secret sauce is just his commitment, kind of his unending commitment. And Matt had this conversation with him. I mean, he used to say, if you couldn't break a rod when you're 9/10 of the way done with it and start over, then it's not the right company for you.
Yeah.
And that commitment to never sending anything out that isn't the very best you can do. He talked to us about your best work being very, very close. The gap between your best work and your worst work being very, very close. And that was kind of his commitment to quality was exemplified in that idea that there's not a lot of variance. Like things are pretty close. And we have this demo rod right now that we were having a friend of ours fish with, and he brought it in after he was done with it. He was like, this rod's great. And we were looking at it. We looked at the serial number. It's 22 years old.
Really?
It's a 22-year-old fly rod, and it looks great, and it fishes great. And, the reality is when you make a really high-quality product, and there's some other examples of this that we'll talk about later, but I think when you make a really great product, it is, in a way, sort of timeless. I mean, not literally timeless, but in a way, it really is a lasting good that you can have and work for you and work for your family and your kids. And, it's kind of this heirloom type of quality is what we really are chasing, and I think that Tom's philosophy, like Matt just kind of said, is that fishing doesn't change so much. I mean, we fish fancier flies now, or we think we know a little bit more about it, but the fish still live in water and eat bugs, and their brain's the size of a pea. I mean, something that worked 25 years ago for our grandpas works for us.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think in any sport, there comes a point where gear becomes a distraction from kind of the pure aspect of the sport. Like even in my sport of choice is running in the mountains, and you need good shoes, and that's really it. And I see people with some kind of fancy backpack and the fancy shoes and compression socks and a satellite watch that's beaming them all this information.
Right.
And I'm not a good runner, but I'll be passing by them on the trail while they're playing with their watch. And I feel like being able to kind of cut away a lot of the BS and just get down to the essence of it. That's what Yvon Chouinard, the guy that started Patagonia, he's a business hero of mine. And it seems like y'all share his philosophy in that we don't want you to buy
him, but he has some working rods. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he does. Yeah. So I think, we certainly think of them a lot in a philosophy of we're not in a sell as much as possible, make a low-priced, high-volume product. That's not really where we are. And I think they definitely exemplify that model. They did a famous ad a couple of years ago that I've always thought about where it was right around Christmas time. It was like 2 or 3 years ago. They put a big full-page ad out that had an old Patagonia coat on it. It said, this year for Christmas, don't buy our stuff.
Yep.
If you have a coat that works for you, don't buy a new coat.
Yep.
And that idea of actually saying to somebody, don't buy our products because our products should be good enough to last.
Sure.
Is such a great, powerful, I think, idea to us, that things can be timeless. And that we live in this culture, like Matt said, like, what's the new thing? What's the shiny thing? What's the best thing? Is it the new name that makes it better? I think with our products, we just don't feel like there's a need for somebody to buy a brand new thing every 2 years or 3 years.
There's a company out of New Hampshire called Limmer Boots. I don't know if you've ever heard of them.
I have, yeah.
And you get on a multi-year waiting list to get your hiking boots made for you, handmade, and you go out there to have the last molded to your feet, and even then you're not close to getting it done. And I had a philosophy professor in college that had a pair of Limmer boots, and he talked about it. For him, cheesy or not, but he said, it's the way I walk through the world in these boots. Is it a disposable item? Is it something I just throw away when I'm done? Or do I spend a little more? Do I build a personal connection with the people that are building these boots for me? And then do I wear them for the rest of my life? And if they need to be fixed, I know the people, they know my boot, they're going to do what they need to do to fix it.
Yep.
And I so for him, that was kind of a, symbolic of the way he wanted to approach things. And when we met Tom, that kind of popped right back into my head, that Limmer boot model, that, having a personal relationship with the person that built your rod. So much about fishing. I can tell you some fish stories or I can show you some pictures, but it's much more about the conversations in the drift boat when we're sitting in the eddy, or the snow squall starts up, or the wind starts coming down, or the wildlife we see on the side of the river, or the drives to the river, or the whiskey at the campsite after the river. And so I think the same thing, like you said, gear being a distraction. what I really like about our rods is gear it's a connection, it's a story, it's a personal relationship, and that's one of the things that really drew us to purchasing the company.
Well, that's leads perfectly into what I wanted to ask you. So I got my MBA in grad school, and the whole time they're teaching us all these so-called business words of wisdom and what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and their whole thing is businesses should scale. You should be able to sell a lot of stuff, move it through. You should be able to automate it. Blah 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 blah. And that's what you see in most companies. I mean, whether it's tech or manufacturing or whatever. So when you guys were considering a business to buy, how did you decide to go? I mean, obviously you love fishing, but did anybody tell you shouldn't buy this because it's not a conventional business model?
Oh, yeah.
Sure. Plenty of people.
That's great.
we told them they were all wrong. Yeah. You don't know what you're talking about. It's a different model. I think, one of the things that appealed to me when we started looking at the company is when you look at the difference between, like you're talking about, kind of traditional high volume businesses where you're trying to scale and really niche boutique small manufacturers, and the differences between those two. When you talk about a company like Hermes, right? So Hermes, they never disclose how much they make of any of their products, and they have a really premium history and following at a premium price point. And it's a different idea, to make fewer of something, to drive demand and maintain your quality. And I think for us, look, the rods cost what they cost, and they. Looking at the process we follow and the process that we learned from Tom, there's no way to make them cheaper unless we sacrifice on this component, or we don't have all made in American parts, or we don't have everything we can get from Montana, unless we start degrading that, the rod doesn't come cheaper. And for us, the value of the company, the value of Tom is making everything as best we can, as good as we can. And we're also not ever going to be a 10,000 a year rod producer. It just doesn't work for a model. For us, it's most important to be, an American-made in Montana heritage type brand that really sticks closely to what Tom envisioned the company being.
Well, if you give some of these business school books the benefit of the doubt, one thing you guys do have going is a barrier to entry.
Right.
I mean, nobody's willing to work that hard, and nobody has the knowledge, the decades and decades of knowledge to do what you guys do. I mean, if I decided I wanted to do that one day, it would be impossible.
It is funny, yeah.
And back to you were talking a little bit earlier about that, but there aren't really secrets. People come through, if you come when you're up in Bozeman, love to show you the shop, and you'll see some things that Tom invented, some machinery, and people always ask, is that patented, or do you have it, behind closed doors, or that kind of thing? And Tom's philosophy was, no, he wanted to share what he knew, and that he was really known around the industry as not being somebody that was, really close to the vest. You'd call him up and he'd talk you through what it was. And when we asked him about that as we were buying the company, he just basically said, if they can spend as much time as I do and source the same quality components as I do, then they can build a great rod. But there's no secrets to it. They just, I'm happy to help them out with their own rod building. And so
it's become like this great legacy of paying it forward. Like the people that Tom helped help us now. The people that are these big names in fly fishing that we've leaned on, in Tom's absence, help us because Tom helped them.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's a really cool environment and community. Yeah.
I was wondering about that. So, he was obviously a legend. And so how has that been stepping in where he was? I mean, it sounds like it's been a pretty good transition. People have been accepting of it and all that kind of stuff.
I think one of our biggest fears that's obvious is that, we're the two yahoos that moved up from Denver. What do they know? And that pretty quickly we thought people were just going to dismiss us. But really, I think two parts. One is that Tom headed up a team of craftsmen. I think of like Dale Chihuly, the glass blower, and how he really has people that are executing his vision. So at Winston, it was, Winston was Winston's model, but under Tom Morgan Rodsmiths, Tom never built a rod. And there are people that didn't know that. People thought that Tom was out there in the shop day after day, but he was in the wheelchair. He couldn't actually work on the lathe or, sand the cork. And so I think in one vein, he ran this team of craftsmen and really just set a vision for what quality standards needed to look like and for processes. And he engineered new ways of doing things and new methods. So we were able to, we're not trying to be Tom, we're not trying to redo new designs. We're not trying to, shake up everything. We're coming in with what he built, following the steps and processes that he made for us. Yeah. And in some ways too, we don't come in with a lot of habits and say, well, I think it should be done another way, because we don't know any better. Mm-hmm. We sit there for that cork handle, we sort 13 cork to match all the same color hue, so that the cork doesn't have rings in it as you look up and down the cork, and it takes forever and it's mind numbing, and you're
getting an intern for that if you're interested.
Yeah. And I'm gonna get to hang out in Bozeman for a few weeks. I might do that.
And we do that for each customer, and we've got the customer's name in front of that handle as we're making it. And I think people that have probably worked for a long time in the fly rod industry would come in and say, that's ridiculous, I'm just not doing that. Mm-hmm. And we didn't know any better, so I guess that's a good thing.
We have no bad habits. All of our habits are Tom and Jerry's habits. So
that's the way. It's like boot camp, I mean, I would imagine nobody, or very, very few people who are running a business have those habits. Maybe somebody in his garage who makes rods for himself or for his family might, but that's pretty intense.
And you can feel it, though. You can feel the pressure. Like, we're getting ready for this show this weekend here in Denver, and we wanted to build one more rod to bring with us, and suddenly working under this timetable, you can feel where your natural tendency is to say, well, maybe we'll do one less coat on the coating, or we'll do, we'll just we won't let the glue dry overnight, and we'll just do it. But you got to fight that. It's a real natural tendency to want to do that. And Tom was in our ear constantly with, you can't listen to those voices. And every time you hear that voice, it's for a reason. You got to go the other way.
Sure. So this is kind of a heady question, I guess, but learning this attention to detail and this focus on the process, has that expanded into your non-work life at all? I would imagine that kind of spending 8, 9, 10, 12, 15 hours a day on that very, very focused attention to detail, attention to process, the highest standards. Have you noticed anything in your personal life change because of that?
Interesting. Yeah. I don't know.
I would say I've noticed it in ways that, like that book, Power of Habit, like how you create habit. Yep. So I've found it where you go to walk past something and you see it on the floor and you notice it, and we all just walk past that thing. And I've consciously make myself pick that up or, make that thing right, because I think if you don't do it all the time, then, you're not going to do it when you need to.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I've always had perfectionist tendencies. I've never really been allowed to engage them, though. I mean, I think in most places people are like, dude, my wife gets so mad when I order at a restaurant because I kind of want everything. I want to figure out some way to combine everything, right? And it just takes me forever to decide because I want it to be perfect. Menu? Oh, yeah. Oh, man, I read everything on the menu. That's how my wife is. Yeah, and it just drives her crazy. And so, in your normal life, we've got all these busy lives, you can't really engage this idea that, there's still a dust speck on there. I'm gonna get that dust speck. Well, there's another dust speck. And that's what we do when we make rods. Everything we can see, we try to fix. Wow. We try to make right. And in a way, it's sort of meditative. There's different steps in the process where I think we both find it's this kind of meditative, where you kind of almost lose yourself in the detail of it. Sure. And I think, I have a 21-month-old at home, so I don't have a lot of time to be meditative with him. It's kind of going all the time. But I think that has affected me. And I think, one of the big drivers, I think, for both Matt and I, when we bought the company, and kind of one of the things that really drew us to Bozeman and Montana and making fly rods and Tom Morgan, was this idea of authenticity and like doing something that felt real. Sure. And I think, in my life, I know in particular, working for a big company, I just didn't feel like I did anything real. Mm-hmm. And this felt so much more real. To talk to a person and make a product for them that is going to bring them enjoyment, to me seemed like the most authentic thing we could do. At least in my life, the best opportunity I had, and I think that was a really powerful draw for us both. Yeah.
Had either of you ever been committed, even just on like a hobby level, to making stuff? I mean, is that something that you guys...
I think that's where, since I was a little kid, we grew up in an old Victorian home where you had to start fixing from the front porch, and by the time you hit the back porch, the front porch was falling off again. So at the earliest ages...
Where did you grow up?
In Windsor, Connecticut. Okay, on the East Coast. But I remember just constant tinkering and building, and that's something I got from my dad. And so that was part of why I wanted to make the jump is I thought of the things, working in a middle school was amazing, and I loved working with the kids and the families, and wouldn't have traded that time for anything. But I found that when I went home and I was stressed, the thing I did is went out in the garage and worked, or I sat down and tied flies, or things like that. So the things I was doing to relieve stress now are my job.
Yeah.
So that's
cool.
Pretty cool thing to be able to have.
Yeah, that's definitely cool. I recently interviewed a woman named Kate Hafstad who makes hats, and she makes these kind of the same idea what you guys do with fly rods she does with hats. And
I wear a lot of hats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
she was talking about how humans. She thinks it's a deep desire in our DNA to make stuff. And if you think about it, that's one of the only few things we have going for us as a species is that we can make tools and team up. And so I think it does reach something inside of us that we don't. Normally in modern day we don't reach because we're looking at computers all day long.
Something I think we got from Tom and kind of fit in well with us and also our employees. We still have many of the same team that worked with Tom still work with us, so we're not just out making it up as we go in the shop. But Tom, if there wasn't something, and I think this is probably very much the Western way or the Montana way, you don't just jump on Amazon and buy a new tool for it. There is no tool for it, so you got to make it.
Yeah.
So it's as common that we're building a rod as that we're sitting at the milling machine, with a thought in our head about a new tool or a new jig or a new something, and we're sitting there creating it. And I that might frustrate people to come up against a problem that can't be solved by Amazon Prime, but I love just trying to be inventive and trying to figure it out and trying to build it, and I think that's probably something that we share with Tom.
Tom used to say every problem is just something that's waiting for a solution. And that's kind of how he viewed things. I really admired that about him. I'm not as handy as Matt. I'm not a builder. I mean, I think I really was drawn to kind of the aesthetic quality of the rods, and the craftsmanship of the rods. But I think I probably fell more victim to that disposable, buy it on Amazon and make it fast.
Sure.
But yeah, I think the whole environment of Bozeman and Montana, having a fly fishing business there. Like we were even talking about it today, driving into Denver. Like the pace and the just the energy is so much different in Bozeman. People just drive slower. People talk to you more. Like it's just like the whole thing is dialed down a little bit, and I think that it was Tom Morgan Rodsmiths and the lifestyle of Bozeman and Montana were the match. That was kind of what brought everything together. Maybe we would have bought car washes in, San Luis Obispo. Who knows? But that town and that opportunity were the things that meshed so well.
That's one thing I wanted to ask you about. When I was in Wyoming, I had the opportunity to either go to Bozeman, move to Bozeman and open an office for the company I was working for, or go to grad school. And I went to grad school, which was good timing when the real estate markets crashed. But I've always loved Bozeman, and I think it's such a cool, authentic, unique place. Can you talk a little bit about living there, how it contributes to the business, how you like it for your families? Just brag about Bozeman a little bit.
Well, the first remark from anybody in Bozeman would be don't talk about Bozeman because they don't want more people moving there.
We're a little traitorous if you ask us that question.
There's quite a bit of growth and expansion there, but really, it's just set in a really naturally beautiful place, and there's any kind of outdoor thing that you want to do is right at your doorstep. But I've really found just the people to be so welcoming and so kind. So even though we're part of that problem, we're the folks that moved up from Denver and are contributing to the growth of Bozeman. People will give you that with a smile and then engage you in a conversation. So it's been really welcoming, people that just come pop into the shop and come by and stop in to talk and just see what we're up to and just visit with us. And I've really enjoyed that piece. And, that's something with our shop. We don't have much of a retail space. There's just a little office in the front, but it's really our production facility. And I love that people come in and get to see how we're doing things and get to just talk things through. And I don't see myself as much of a salesman. I'm not, trying to sell stuff, but I love just talking about what we do. And a lot of times that results with people saying, I want to be a part of this. I want to have something like this and wanting a rod. So that's been a lot of fun. Yeah,
it's a neat place up there. I feel like Montana, it's like a mini Alaska, and that everything is bigger. The landscape, the valleys are bigger, the rivers are bigger, the wildlife's bigger. It's super cool.
I mean, that's a great corollary to Alaska. Yeah,
been really interesting to have, we got row drift boats down at Four Corners and Sims, and we're making rods there, and Big Sky Rod Box, and Bozeman reels and 406 lines. I mean, you can do everything in fly fishing.
Everybody we know is at least a part-time fishing guy, pretty much, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you sit next to somebody in my son's swim class, and her husband's a part-time fishing guy.
Sure.
Everybody fishes, and so you kind of that community. Everybody understands the product and what you're trying to do and how it's different.
Yeah.
Which is really nice. I mean, I think I grew up west of Denver, and I just grew up outside. We were outside all the time, and I think Matt and I both felt kind of Denver's growth and living pretty close and in downtown. Our kids just wouldn't have that experience. They just wouldn't be outside all day long, playing in rivers and skiing and snowshoeing and falling around and climbing trees. And I think Bozeman is such a great. It's so cliche to say a great family environment or a great place for kids, but it just feels like it's such a great community for that. It's so accessible and so small, and you're right next to the streams, and you're right next to the mountains. And it's going to,
I think having a university there adds a lot of character to it, and it's a cool place. People think Denver, people who haven't spent a lot of time in Denver think Denver is Colorado mountains, so I'm going to live in the mountains, but you're an hour from the mountains here. I mean,
I know, it hurts my heart. I grew up here. It's changed.
Yeah, I mean, it really, to get from Denver to a trailhead, it's at least an hour. And we recently moved from Boulder, and we were trying to figure out where we wanted to be. And the only reason I live out here is because of the mountains. And so I'm not going to live an hour from the mountains. And so, we're in Colorado Springs now, which is, I'm 10 minutes from a trailhead.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to be said for being in the middle of it, especially in the fishing world. Man. So can we talk a little bit about how you guys ended up acquiring this business, or what that process was like? Because I would imagine it was not the kind of thing where some sort of business broker or banker or somebody said, all right, highest bidders, we're taking bids. It was more of a long interview to get to know you guys. I think that would probably be a lot more important than the
so I think I mentioned, so I kind of knew about the company, and I would kind of cruise the website for Tom Morgan Rod Smith. So I'd tell my wife when I get off the computer, hey, I need to buy some of these rods before they're not around anymore. I got to do this and that, and then I'd buy 4 Sages in the same time period, not buy a Morgan rod, and they had put a notice up on the website. So it was during one of my every 6 months forays on the website, I saw the notice. And I saw it and was like, wow, so they're selling it. I wonder what's going on. And kind of thought about it, went to bed, woke up the next morning, was still kind of thinking about it. So sent an email, and Jerry responded really quickly, and I kind of started talking to Matt, another friend of ours. It was kind of this fancy daydream, right? Like, hey, you want to make fly rods in Montana and fish all the time, and for free with all the best guides in the world, and all that kind of stuff. And we started kind of thinking about it, and Matt and I had lamented kind of the state of Denver, and having young kids in Denver, and how that was going to work out long term. And so we had all these confluence of factors kind of coming together, and then really over the next couple months, we sent a couple more emails and started talking to them, and there's a little qualification process. Mm-hmm. So they're like, they want to talk to people that weren't serious about it. So we did some of that stuff, and and kind of kept talking to them, and got to the point where we wanted to come visit Bozeman. Matt and his family were actually in Jackson visiting some friends, and Lindsay and I had some time, my wife and I had some time, so we were going to be in Bozeman, and they came up to Bozeman to meet us. We rented a house and kind of spent a long weekend there, and towards the end of the weekend had decided we'd go out and visit Tom and Jerry. And so you can see it on the website, but they have this house that's kind of outside of town on the way to the Madison River on a bluff, kind of looking at, surrounded by mountain ranges with this amazing vista, and they overlook Uncle Ted's place, so it's kind of on the edge of Ted Turner's ranch.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, they're out there, and you drive on this road. It's the only thing out there really on this hilltop overlooking the mountains. You drive up there, and it's this kind of monumental experience to make that pilgrimage. Sure. And lots of people have done it over the years. People have come from as far away as Japan to go see Tom and pick up their rod and and spend the day with Tom. And you walk in and meet them, and it was kind of an overwhelming experience to meet him, and having read about him and heard about his story, and meet Jerry and talk to them about the business and see the shop that they had built, and then we went outside, and they gave us a bunch of rods to cast, and of course the minute we walk outside, the wind picks up, and Tom's sitting at the big window in the kitchen watching us cast in 20 30 mile an hour winds, these little bamboo rods and fiberglass rods, and we're talking to each other. I hope we don't, no tailing loops here, taking time, And we come back in, and it's closest we probably got to a casting compliment from Tom. He said we were okay. We were okay casters. And then we left, and we're like, well, that was kind of cool. And they said, we had some other people looking at the business, and it hasn't worked out for a variety of reasons, but and I said, look, we'd like to take 4 or 6 weeks here and put together our best offer, and proceed from there, and kind of left feeling like, well, this maybe is something we could do.
Yeah.
And Lindsay and I drove back to Denver, and then Matt was coming back, and they called him the day he left, 2 days later, I think. And Matt called me and said, hey, they've got another offer, so we have a week.
Ooh.
Yeah, to put something together. So then it was like all hands on deck. And we kind of, started running pretty hard and doing as much as we could, and made an offer that they accepted.
Nice.
And so then spent the next, 8 months, basically, with weekly calls. We just had all these timelines and kind of metrics that we wanted to do as we were doing diligence and working through the deal with them.
Yeah.
And trying to come up, with money and doing inventory and looking at vendors and all these different kinds of things. And that ended up really with kind of the resolution of the deal on February 1st of this last year, 2017. So we'd spent a lot of time, going through, and with this kind of a company, it's never a straight value proposition, I think, either.
No,
because for us, it is kind of a lifestyle. It is kind of a quality of life decision for us. Uh-huh. And we certainly I had a couple of guys that were in M&A that this was such a small deal for them. They were like, I can't do this for you on payroll, but I'll give you advice. And they're like, this is crazy. You'd offer, half of what you're thinking about. And I was like, well, I get it. But, part of the deal with this too is we wanted to learn from them. Uh-huh. We wanted them to stay a part of the company and really teach us how to continue what they had built.
Yeah.
And it wasn't buy a disposable business and just scale it up and run it, for more money. It wasn't that type of a transaction for us.
I think to hear them tell it too, I think it went both ways. They had a number of buyers come across and had deals not work out for one reason or another, and it was a lot of what you talked about, traditional modeling. People wanted to push blank production overseas, or people wanted to move it out of Montana, or people wanted to make a low price point rod, an entry level Morgan, just to get it in the hands of everybody and put it in retail spaces. And so everybody had a lot of ideas that kind of fell into the generic model of rod building right now.
We'll give you $50,000 now and pay you back in 2 years, or it's a lot of those kind of models.
Yeah.
So I think what they liked about us is, from the start, we said we want to keep it here in Montana. We want to source as many products as we can locally, and have everything else come from within the states. And we want to hand build each rod and have a personal relationship with the customers. We don't want to go retail. We want to raise our families around this. I want the boys there's Legos and Matchbox cars all over our shop because the boys are in there playing. So.
We think Hudson's the only 4-year-old with a Morgan rod, right?
Hud did get a 5-weight for his 4th birthday.
Nice.
Right.
He says, Dad, I want to fish my 5-weight. I'm like, oh, God.
Worst case.
If you're starting out now at 4 with a TMR rod.
I don't know where he goes from there.
Yeah. Well, in 14 years, if he needs like a down payment for college or something, he's got to put that thing out.
He'll be sweeping the shop.
Yeah.
That's, man, well, that's cool. So you took possession in quotes of the company in February, and pretty soon thereafter Tom passed away, correct?
Mm-hmm. He passed away in June of this year. Yeah, June 12th.
So was that, I bet that was just devastating for everybody.
Yeah, we didn't see it coming, they didn't see it coming. The one thing he did say to us when we met him is he said, if I ever get pneumonia, that's what's going to get me. Mm-hmm. And but he otherwise was in good health, and really because of Jerry. I mean, I think what a lot of people don't know is she was making rods full-time and his full-time caregiver. So, between coatings on the bamboo rod, she was running in and, changing out the sheets on the bed, or, getting him up into his wheelchair and feeding him and things like that. So her care really, kept him strong, but he ended up developing pneumonia, and it happened pretty fast. We were all working on a rod together on a Thursday, and he passed on that Sunday. So things were going well, and then they weren't, and it all happened pretty quick.
So, how did you guys even process that? Because, that's just, that's huge. That's a huge loss on so many levels. But, was it, I guess Jerry, I want to hear more about Jerry. I want to hear more about Jerry right now, because she seems like a force of nature.
She is.
Can you just talk about her personality and kind of...
Yeah, so Jerry, for Tom's engineering mindset, Jerry is an artist. So they kind of, had different approaches to things, but really kind of common ways of looking at them once they were together.
Yep.
And Jerry's super creative, and she journals and she paints and she does, all of these really interesting things. So it was a logical piece when they teamed up to build rods together. But yeah, her kind of dogged approach to everything. She's just doesn't take no, and and she just, like we said, she was Tom's caregiver, and really just.
I think we still learn something from Jerry every day.
Yeah. So how much?
We still see her quite a bit. I mean, we just had moved kind of one of the final processes of the rod building process out of their garage shop. We just did that last week, but I think I'd been up there for just about every day, 2 weeks straight. Yeah, and I think we're really, really very fortunate. I think the loss of Tom, like you said, was terrifying in a lot of ways. It was obviously unexpected, but the presence of Jerry, I think, has really made that not as impactful as it could have been. Sure. And the continued support of her and her understanding the process and having become, I think, maybe even to her surprise, such a tremendous rod builder. For somebody that didn't have Tom's background in this.
And
becoming
fish.
really his extension. Yeah, right. And not really a fisherman, but a craftsperson, and an artist, and understanding, kind of the minute attention to detail that's required. I think we're really just so fortunate because she's such a part of the company still, and will be for many years going forward. So I think, we're very fortunate for that. And I think, one of some of the best advice I ever got, I know I'm stealing one of your questions from later, but, is that fear is excitement without the breath. And I think that we find ourselves so much in our life, and I'm not a yogi and I'm not a Buddhist, but, I think when I find myself stressed, I realize I'm not breathing.
Oh, yeah.
And you can feel the tightness
yes.
in your chest. And when those kind of things happen, if you can just remind yourself to breathe, and that almost physically moves you forward.
It does.
And helps you kind of move through those things. And so I think, although it was unexpected, I think we knew that Tom wasn't going to be around for 20 years. And in many ways, I think we were thankful that it happened as it did because we had time with him, and we were able to kind of learn a lot of the things that we needed to learn from Tom from a design standpoint. And then from Jerry, we learned really the application of all of those things in the making of these rods.
I think for me, I remember Jerry saying, I need you to call Gary Loomis, and I need you to call Annette over at Winston and tell them and let them know what happened. I'm just feeling overwhelmed, and I got on the phone, and both of them, these icons in the industry just said, we're here for you guys, and, obviously sad about what happened with Tom, but they just were so reassuring how in ways that Tom had given to them during earlier on in their careers, and they just said, don't worry, we're here to give back to you guys. And that really was grounding for me. And then I think the most important thing is at the hotel that Tom's parents owned back in Ennis, we had a memorial kind of gathering for him in July, and it was just friends and family, and even people that just owned a couple rods flew in just to come to this thing. And it's just this really, Joel and I were out fishing on Odell Creek in the morning, just able to kind of reflect on what was happening, and just the gathering of people and the support. And I think we left that going a little bit from that being terrified to feeling like we can do this. So it was a roller coaster this summer.
I'm sure it was. Yeah. I mean, just owning a new business is enough of a roller coaster, and you throw that in. But you guys wouldn't say this, but I would imagine that there was a lot of relief on their end as well, that they had good stewards of this business in place. Because if this whole thing if that had happened a year or two earlier, it would have been even rougher, I would imagine. So it's kind of as sad as it is, it's kind of like a poignant transition for the business. Can you guys talk a little bit about the Odell rod, the one rod that actually has a name for a limited time? Because it's a cool story, and it involves a former podcast guest, Doub Beardsley, who's super cool and is all about what you guys are doing. So can you tell the story of that rod?
Sure.
Yeah, so that rod we were talking about designing, Tom said, I want to mentor you guys through this design process, but I'm not just going to tell you about it. Let's actually work on a rod together. Let's work on this design that I've had in my head. I want to design this 4-weight rod, and I want to talk you guys through all of it. And Joel, you might want to talk about some of those bedside.
Yeah, so we kind of had set up times to sit. He pretty good in the morning, so he had his morning routine, and then he had some time in the morning where he was usually doing computer work, and we would kind of sit and go over patterns and talk about some of his design philosophies. And I think, I'm assuming, I don't know other rod designers as well as we know Tom, but I think people have different approaches to how you make a fly rod. And there's different materials and there's different ideas. And so, one of Tom's guiding principles with design was he was always most concerned about the tip of the fly rod.
Okay.
So he was a dry fly fisherman, relatively short distance, and really wanted to feel everything that was going on when you're casting and fishing with the tip of the fly rod. So he was a tip first designer. And had some different ideas around tapers, and then we do some different things with joints. Basically, where we're making the sections of the rods, whether it's a 4-piece or a 2-piece. And so kind of learn some of those things from him and some of the key things. And I guess if there is secret sauce, there is a little bit of secret sauce in some of the metrics we use. And really, rod design, you take those principles, it's kind of an inverted triangle. So you have these principles of tips the most important, the butt ends up wherever it is, and then you have some things that go into a spreadsheet and not to get too into fly rod design, but essentially what you're doing is, these rods are long, so you're creating hollow tubes of fabric that are tapered. Essentially, and you put that in a spreadsheet, and there's a little bit of overlap in the two sections that we make when we make blanks, and then you look at things like how much the fiber or the fabric is wrapped around when you make that tube, and there's some ideas around that, and you basically make a dynamic spreadsheet where you change different measurements, and it affects things like overlap and inner diameter and predicted outside diameter and some things like that. And I think the real trick, for fly rod design is understanding what those numbers mean when they translate to the rod being in somebody's hand. And so that's a lot of the conversations we had were around, how the math works when you do that, and how that then influences what a Morgan rod is. And I think a Morgan rod is different than an Orvis rod or a Sage rod or a fly rod or a Sage rod or something like that. And they all have different ideas about how that works. And I think that understanding some of those things from Tom, I think, really helped us. And so then we go to a pattern. So you get kind of that basic stuff, and then you look at a specific pattern, and you say, well, if I do this or that, how's it going to change? And so we kind of arrive at a design, and then you got to make it. So, you roll a blank, and you get the blank in, you wiggle it around, you deflect it, you bend it, you make the rod, you cast it. And so we went through that process with Tom, up to the design process, and then unfortunately, he passed. So we have this design from Tom, right, that we think was his new 8-foot 4-weight 2-piece rod, and we make the blanks, and materials greatly influence blanks, resins can influence blank or fly rod design. So we make a couple of them, we bring them back to the shop, and one of the great legacies Tom created for us is the people that were his hands as casters still support us. So we bring those guys in, and they start casting out in the parking lot, and we talk to them about what they liked and didn't like, and we found out those rods really weren't what we were looking for.
Interesting.
So then, like Matt had mentioned, we were able to call up some of these people. Like, I'm still in awe. We can call Gary Loomis and Kate Berkheimer, and they pick up the phone and say, I think about it, and they talk to us about it, design, and give us these insights that we don't have.
That makes me feel better about the world in general.
It really does. Kind of yeah. They weren't like, you guys are on your own. Get out of here. So they give us some ideas, and we go back and look at the notes we had from Tom and Tom's ideas, and look at some of his old fly rods, that had been made before, and we come up with a slightly different tweak of that design, and we make them again and bring them back and start casting them again and do that kind of iterative process. And so we were lucky that pretty quickly thereafter, with the people that knew Tom and cast for Tom, agreed that this rod was an extension of what Tom would have wanted.
So when Tom passed, we went from it was just going to be like everything else. It was just going to be the 2-piece 8'4", fitting into the line. And we said, you know what, this rod begs doing something special with it. So we were driving out to the Golden Gate Angling Club, and we just started kind of batting around names, and we thought, the Odell would be perfect, because when Tom described the design of this rod, he described fishing Odell Creek and why he wanted a rod that cast a certain distance or for a certain fish, and this was really the creek he had in mind when he was designing this rod. So we said, let's do 50 of them in honor of Tom. Let's do it the way Tom would have wanted it. So everything, when you call up and you get to pick your handle or pick your reel seat wood or pick your hardware and things, we're doing this one, you don't get a choice. You're doing it the way Tom would have done it. So he liked the Western cigar grip, and he liked the down-locking hardware because it got the reel down to the bottom of the rod. And we're using some box elder wood that Tom really liked to make the 50 reel seats with. And then I was, just kind of racking my brain with another way to kind of honor Tom and make it special. And Duke is a friend of a friend, and we've got some friends in common. And I was on a trip down to Denver and went out to his studio, and we just started kind of batting around ideas and talking about fly fishing. And we had a lot of common places and common stories, and we just really hit it off in that way. And at the end of it, he really said, I want to do something that's special for this project. So cool. I'm going to come up with a print, and you guys will make 50 rods. I'll make 50 prints. We'll number them, and number 1 goes with number 1 of the rod and the print set. But he said, one thing I'm committed to is that my work does something bigger than you and I and just selling some rods. And it's something I think that Joel and I believe very much in too. So, I said, I agree. Let's think of a way that we can partner up on this rod. And so Whitney, who's the director of Casting for Recovery, is someone we know through Bozeman, and it's just phenomenal in her own right. And Casting for Recovery gets women in various stages of breast cancer out on the water to fish and empowers them through fly fishing on wherever they are within their journey. And so we decided that it was something that was meaningful to me, meaningful to Joel, meaningful to Duke, and we decided to donate one of the rods and one of the prints to Casting for Recovery that they could auction off to benefit them. And and back to your point about big business, we can't just throw big checks here and there to help out, but it's meaningful and impactful to us on a project like this that we can help any way we can.
Well, that's a partnership between 3 different groups that are all, have these common goals and common values. Duke is such a supporter of conservation and important issues. He uses his art for that, and you guys are using your rods for that, and then Casting for Recovery is doing great work. And so I think that's really cool, and that's how we got connected. So that's awesome. So last question about the business, because I know you guys have important stuff to do. Where do you see the business going in 3, 5, 10 years? I know you're almost at a year. That's barely even getting your feet wet. And so what's the plan?
I think, our dream is to find a way to sustain in everything that we've talked about today. Tom, we talked a lot with Tom about what's the magic number of rods you need to sell in a year to do what we're talking about. And he didn't have a firm answer, but he said you'll kind of know it when you get there. Cool. And as soon as we have to start cutting corners on rod production and feeling like we're kind of slaves to that production model and quality going down, we know we've hit that number. We need to back off. So we really want to, in 3, 5, 10 years, we want to make enough rods where we're able to still make them custom, make them for each individual customer. We want to, know you. We want to share fishing stories. We want you to come up to Bozeman and, see the shop and see where your rod was built and be a part of that. One thing, we're going to start working with Montana Angler this summer to try to do some partnered trips. Nice. Things where you come out and you use our rods during a trip and you cast, and we provide some casting instruction through instructors that we know. You get to hear about Tom, hear the story, see the shop as part of the travel, and then be with them in world-class water in Montana fishing. And that those are ways that we're looking to broaden a little bit beyond what Tom and Jerry did. Is just we got to be a little creative, because rods sold themselves with Tom. People were on a pilgrimage to find Tom. We have to kind of come up with some different ways to do it, and so I think that if you come back in 5 years, it'll look very much the same, hopefully.
As it should.
We'd like to grow, but we'd like to grow very slowly.
Sure, yeah.
Because I think that's the only way, like Matt said, we can keep things at the same quality level they are now. And I think we're never going to be a multinational outdoor company. We understand that. We're okay with that.
I think that's a great realization to have, and know that, talking about Yvon Chouinard, he came close to losing that company a few times because he got focused on growth versus making good stuff.
Right.
And I think being able to have kind of mentors from afar like that and learn lessons, that's, if you're smart enough to see it.
I read an article, my wife read it to me while we were driving to go skiing in Crested Butte, and it was the rise and fall of J. Peterman, the company, the outdoor company, or they became kind of a clothing company.
Kind of famous from Seinfeld, right?
Yeah. And but really it was about like finding your true north and staying dedicated to your true north. And sometimes you'll be presented with business decisions that kind of like candy. They look good in the short term, and they're going to probably make some money in the short term, but because you get away from that North Star, then in the long term they become the ruin of your company. So maybe you expand too fast, or maybe you start selling products that don't really relate to what your core is, and then you lose that core customer base, things like that. So that article read right at the right time for me. It's really resonated for me that we ask ourselves a lot. We're faced with some different things. Do we partner with this group, or do we let these people talk about our rods and so on? And sometimes in the short term it might result in a rod sale, and it seems like it's great, but in the long term it gets away. They don't necessarily align with what we want to do or represent the same things that we want to represent. So we've kind of kept coming back and saying, does this represent our true north? Is it where we're going? And we've turned down some opportunities that might have sold a couple rods here and there pretty quickly.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot, and I think it's been interesting. I mean, I think the idea of buying a business, I guess not surprisingly, it takes lots of different shapes, right?
Sure.
And I think that at some points I had this feeling like we're just buying a car and somebody's giving us the keys, right? Don't crash the car.
Yeah.
But the reality is you got to fill up the car with gas. You got to figure out where you're going to drive it. You got to clean it. You got maintain it. You got to change the oil.
Yeah.
There's a lot of decisions that pretty quickly we had to make. And still do, that could change the company drastically if we're not really careful with it. That really change that idea. And we want to do things, and it's tempting. I think especially in this world, it's tempting to do things really fast or just grab money or try to sell, as much as you can right away. And I think we're fortunate in that we're not in a position where we have to do those things. Mm-hmm. We can make choices that maybe are a little counterintuitive to your regular MBA student, and then hope that they work out, and that if we stay dedicated to that and really stay devoted to making what Tom thought was the best trout rod you could make. We're not making rods for GTs. We're not making spare rods. We want to make the best trout rod. Maybe someday when we think we've done that and there's nowhere else to go, then we'll look at these other things.
Yeah.
But we're trying to maintain our focus as much as we can.
That's cool, and that's great to hear. You just see how a lot of businesses operate, and it's disheartening. And so it's guys like y'all and Chenard and those folks. It's a rarity, but it needs to be there. So I appreciate it. So some of the quick questions that I've asked pretty much everybody I've had on the podcast, I like to run through a few of those, just because it's cool to compare the answers. Mm-hmm. What are your favorite, if you have one or two or three favorite books related to the American West?
Yeah, it's funny. I've talked to you a little bit. You're a nonfiction guy. And
yeah, completely.
I was a literature major in college, so I fall right down the fiction realm. But anything by Wallace Stegner, but Angle of Repose is kind of a iconic Western novel.
My wife just finished that last week, and I loved it.
Yeah, no, it's a great book. I also think about fishing. The River Why. Have you read River Why?
I have not. I've got it on my shelf, but I haven't read it.
That's a book. It's rare for me to go back and reread books.
Really?
It's also rare for me to laugh out loud when I'm reading a book, and that's a book I've reread a number of times and found myself sitting in public just laughing out loud.
Somebody else I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was somebody who I had on the podcast who said the exact same thing. Yeah, that's cool. I need to read more fiction.
Yeah.
Well, and I need to get through more novels.
Yeah, I'm a fiction guy, but I read books so fast. It's a tough question. But I love Cormac McCarthy, and so like All the Pretty Horses, that's kind of a more Southwestern story. I love that book. The movie I thought was just so terrible, but the book I thought was great.
Yeah.
And it's so cliche, but my favorite book ending ever is A River Runs Through It.
Uh-huh.
I think I read that book in college, and just that last paragraph of that book is just haunting to me.
I need to read more fiction.
Yeah.
I really do.
We'll start. You give us 3 nonfiction titles. We'll give you 3 fiction titles.
We can drag each other through this. Yeah.
I've got so many. I get so many good recommendations, and I try my hardest.
The older I get, the more I am amazed every time I walk in a bookstore.
Really?
How much creativity is just represented in a bookstore.
I love books.
All those people writing original things.
And that is
it's just
hard.
amazing. I couldn't write a book.
I think that'd be the hardest. I'd love to. I have dreams of one day writing a book, but I can't. It just seems like the hardest thing I can do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and I do some decently hard physical stuff, and I'm like, it's nothing compared to writing a book. It would destroy me. Maybe one day when I'm tougher. Any favorite documentaries or films?
It's a good question. And we were talking about this yesterday a little bit, Matt and I both. I think, I tend to think of them as they fall in different categories. The most impactful film for me probably was Platoon because of the age I was when I saw it. Mm-hmm. It was such just an eye-opening film about the world. And what war is and all these different things. So I just think of that as, but I wouldn't sit down and watch it,
Yeah.
But it had such an impact on me as a young man, I think. Documentaries, oh gosh, there's a kind of crazy documentary called I Like Killing Flies. It's an old documentary about this really kind of savant cook in New York City, in Brooklyn, who had this literally tiny restaurant, and he had literally 400 items on his menu.
Wow.
And it was a kitchen that was like 4x4, and he had invented all these tools that allowed him to stand in one place over the kitchen and make all the meals. He had a rule: if you had a reservation for 6 people, he immediately kicked you out. If you asked for a table of 6, no tables of 6, he would immediately kick you out. And there's an amazing point in the documentary, this guy, and it was kind of a commentary on gentrification in New York and all these other different things that were going on. But his restaurant was in the first floor of this building. It was being turned into condos. So he was getting kicked out by the developer.
Yeah.
And he was just lamenting the fact that his world was turned upside down and his customers wouldn't be able to find him anymore at the new location, and just destroyed by this event that was going to change his life. And the camera pans, and the new location is a block and a half away at the end of the street.
I need to look that up.
Yeah, so it was a really fun documentary. Yeah, I like killing flies.
I think one I used to show my students all the time was a movie called Rivers and Tides about artist Andy Goldsworthy.
Okay.
And he did a lot of art, natural art in the moment. So he would do things where he would build this like phenomenal structure combining ice and rock, but as soon as the sun came up over the ridge, the whole thing fell apart.
Yeah.
Or he'd build something below the high tide mark, and it was like this phenomenal driftwood structure, and he spent half a day doing it, and then the tide came up and the whole thing washed away. But it was kind of like the monks that do the sand art, beauty in the moment kind of thing. So
I was thinking about the monks and the sand art when you guys were talking about building the rides, and that you got to be ready to snap it when you're 95% done.
Yeah.
It's the same idea, and just focus on the process and not the goal, which is hard to do, man. What is the most powerful experience you've ever had in the outdoors? And that could be funny, scary, crazy, memorable.
I think for me, I was climbing a couple 14ers with friends from here in Denver, and we got caught in a lightning storm, where everything just turns upside down all at once, and hail, and we were under, I think of us, as guys that were pretty prepared in general, but just underprepared for clothing in that moment.
Sure.
Lightning happening below you is a pretty humbling thing when you're high enough that you're in the clouds.
What mountain were you on?
Where were we?
I wasn't there, but I remember the story.
I'm blanking on the mountain. It probably fried out of me. Yeah. But we finally made the call to climb in to this little small cave and just ride it out. And that was the closest I've come to moments of like, I may not make it back down. And then the whole thing just came through as quick as it went, and that was it.
Makes you feel real small.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was fishing in Alaska a couple of years ago with my wife, who's not much of a fisherman. She comes sometimes, and there was a specific spot we wanted to get to, kind of in the pre-dawn. It was this big gravel shelf with a bunch of spawning salmon, and below it there was a drop, and there were, it's hard to estimate, thousands of trout and char that were eating eggs. And so if you got there, first boat in, you could basically sit there and just fish, catch a fish every cast.
Sure.
And so we were trying to get there. So it kind of pre-dawned on a big river called the Kenai in Alaska.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
And we came around a bend in a drift boat, and it was us and some other people from the lodge, both 2 drift boats. And a sow with 3 cubs was crossing the river. It's a big, broad river, right? And so 2 of the cubs had gotten across the river, and one of the cubs was kind of lagging behind her. So we ended up getting between her and the cubs. And it's a big enough river that it wasn't super scary at that point. But the cubs obviously were crying from the other bank, and she was kind of huffing and kind of talking back to them. And so we're kind of floating down between them, and we're far enough away that it's not super dangerous, but we're staying in the boat, and we get to the point where we want to stay. And so she's kind of agitated at this point because we're between her and the cubs. We get down a little bit below her, and we anchor up where we'd like to fish, and we're in headlamps at this point. It's kind of pre-dawn light, and we look up, and she charges us from about 100 yards and stands up, and you can see the water. You're close enough to see the water dripping off of her fur. And my wife's crawling up under the gunnel of the boat. She's like, I think I can fit up here. Yeah. And the guide's on the oars. Like, you just pull anchor and keep going down the river. That's your only option, right? And full-on roars, with water dripping off of her on their back 2 feet. And then drops down and woofs at us and swims across the river. So that's the closest I've ever had to like a real bear encounter. I've seen bears and been around them, but not a mad bear. Yeah.
That's the real deal.
That was a good one.
This is a hard question, but for me at least, I don't know what my answer would be. But where is your favorite place in the West? Do you have a favorite location? It could be town, mountain, lake, anywhere.
I think a place I stumbled through and then keep finding my way back to without maybe even being that intentional about it is Pinedale, Wyoming.
Yeah.
It still feels small. It feels like what it should be. It's, and ironically, it's probably a lot of times on the drive to Jackson, which is so much bigger and, built up. But Pinedale is just the real deal, and the fishing's great there, and the access to the winds, and, sitting at the brewery at the end of a long day. And we found some great little, places to stay, and people are really kind. And I don't think it's totally been overrun, people are still pretty happy to see you.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So, that's a great place.
Yeah, I love South Park. My family has a cabin up in South Park, Colorado. Yeah. Yeah, it's just had some great moments up there, and it feels kind of, I guess, a little bit like you were describing, Matt. Like, it just feels kind of desolate compared to the I-70 corridor.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, there's so many great places that you're close to there, and the Expanse, they have their cabins kind of up on the northeastern side of South Park, so you're kind of looking out, and that Expanse is just kind of stunning. And yeah, I think one of my favorite moments from there was just standing in a stream, and it was kind of it was a birthday party weekend maybe, so you're kind of thinking, like, I'm getting older, and I was standing in the middle of a stream, I've been tying a knot. I don't know how long I was tying the knot for. And one of our buddies walked up to me and said, "What are you doing?" I was like, "I don't know. I'm just kind of standing here looking." And I've been there for a while, I think. I wasn't fishing. I was just standing in the river, just kind of appreciating everything. Yeah.
That was when I first came to Colorado in high school. That was my first taste. We, for some reason, flew into Colorado Springs and then drove over that pass into South Park. And that was my first view of 14,000-foot mountains and, the big valley. That is a special place. I still don't know how I would answer that question. I should have figured that out. So, last one of these quick questions. What is the best piece of advice you've ever received? And you kind of answered that. Any others?
I don't even know. I've heard so much. A lot of it's about, as I've gotten older, I feel like people that have just told me, slow down. Like if you want to reply to somebody in email, don't call them in person. My dad always used to say, "Why don't you think before you act?" And so I don't know, just lots of things about being mindful and then not impulsive. And I think some of that comes with just growing older, becoming a parent. But it's good. It rings in the back of my head.
I think that's great.
I'd say another quote of mine, I think, as being, we talk about this sometimes, but kind of an old dad, which I think is not that uncommon these days. But my mom told me one time, it's impossible to spoil a baby. You remember that, right?
Yeah. So you got a 20.
Just all love, all the time. Yeah. I think we're getting to the close to the point where you can start spoiling them.
Yeah, you're right on the
revisit
edge.
that topic. Yeah,
I got a 2.5-year-old, and she's definitely needs some correcting. So somewhere between those two. So last big question, if you can make a request of the people listening to this podcast, and it's just people that love the American West in one way or the other, through fishing, conservation, ranching, athletics, art, whatever, if you could make a request of those people or give them some words of wisdom, what would it be?
I think, really re-examining that question of need versus want. And when it comes to things like gear, I think about what we throw away. Think about how we churn through things. Think about, the latest, greatest jacket just because a panel has a different color on it or something like that. And really embrace and live that ethos of, like, I'm going to wear this jacket till it falls off me. I'm going to wear these waders until they have 7 patches in them. And, I'm going to buy this fly rod because it's going to be something I hand to my son, not because it's something I'm going to, flip out in 2 years. So I think this journey has really made me re-examine a lot of consumerism and need versus want. And so I think just re-examining that, I think the West is gonna, it faces a lot of resource challenges and overgrowth and expansion. And I think, just thinking about what we have and what we need is important.
Yeah, I'd say there's nothing cooler than something that's been honestly used.
I agree.
Right. I mean, I think we're all kind of a lot of us are coming back to that idea, and I would just add to that idea too. I think, take the time to find your local makers, take the time. There's nothing more satisfying than buying something, for me, that's made in Bozeman, Montana, because that's where I live, and that idea of kind of creating community and creating community not only by the people you know and the people you interact with, but the people that you buy your stuff from. It's such a cool idea now. And I think, we talk about development in the West and all those things, and I think community building starts with sourcing the things for your life there, and I just urge people to seek that stuff out, because there are so many great heritage craftsmen all over the United States that are making wallets and pants and boots and hats and fly rods. So
I had a question for you in the quick fire round. As you've met all these people, have you found a common thread? Like, when you think about people that are kind of, in your words, shaping the modern West, have you found a common thread or something that you think kind of links those influencers together?
I was thinking about that, and everybody's doing so many different things. I was actually thinking about this maybe last week, and I was thinking that so many of these people that I've interviewed, they're not from here. A lot of them are not from here. Even some, like the guy Jim Howell, he's this world famous rancher, and he's kind of created this whole way of grazing that fights global warming, is good for the grasslands. But he was born in Anaheim, California, and then I interviewed an artist who's one of the up-and-coming Western artists, Marc Majori. He's from France. He was in a rock band before, a French rock band, before he started painting. And so it's all these interesting people. And I was thinking, and I feel like everybody I've talked to fits in this, is that in order to come to the West and be accepted and contribute, you need to be, the traits that stick out are you need to be humble and you need to be hardworking. And I was thinking about that when we were talking, actually, because I feel like that's the same approach you guys have taken. So I feel like that's starting to be the theme, is that you can't come out here acting like you know everything and you're some loudmouth who's going to, knows every bit and you don't need any help. And you need to come in with a humble attitude, and you need to be willing to work extremely hard. And if you think about the stereotypical rancher who's been out here since the 1850s or whatever, 1870s, that's, they're soft-spoken and they kind of watch people, and they're real quick to call out somebody who's full of BS. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing that, if you think about what those guys respect more times than not, it's somebody who's willing to work hard and willing to be humble and learn. And that seems to be the common thread, and I can't think of anybody I've talked to who doesn't really fit in that. Mm-hmm. That's as far as mindsets. I feel like mindsets and interest, it's like we were talking about before we started recording. Everybody's got different ideas about some political things or whatever, but there is, if you think about concentric circles, there is this overlap, that a love for the landscape and a respect for conservation. And, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, I've interviewed people on both sides, they all have in common that they love the landscape out here, and they love the communities, and they want to see it not taken advantage of. And so I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it's great.
I didn't know I was going to get interviewed. So how can people find more about you guys online? Where should they look?
Yeah, our website's tommorganrodsmiths.com.
Yep.
We have an Instagram at tommorganrodsmiths.
Yep.
We're pretty new to all this tech stuff too, so we're poking around
somewhere, I think.
Yeah, I don't even know about Facebook. Yeah.
I'll dig it up.
Better yet, just give us a call.
Yeah.
Come by the shop.
Yeah,
talk to us.
Come to the shop.
Yeah, I'll be up there. Well, thank y'all so much.
Yeah, definitely.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast, and thanks for listening to that particular episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Before you go, I've got 3 quick things. Number 1, if you like the podcast, please do me a huge favor. Either pass it along to a friend who may be interested, share it on your social media, or go to iTunes and give it a 5-star review. All those things would mean a lot to me, and they would really help to spread the word about the podcast. Number 2, if you've listened to many of these episodes, you know that I love reading and I love talking about books. Every other month, I send out a quick email with a few books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The subjects are varied, but they're pretty much all nonfiction with an emphasis on history, biographies, adventure narratives, and topics related to the American West. There are no sales pitches for ranches, no spam, no other kind of nonsense, just books. So if you'd like to sign up for the list, head to Mountain and Prairie/reading, or just go to Mountain and Prairie and there's a massive tab at the top that says book recommendations. Click on it. There are a ton of good books that I've read. Some of the old email lists are on there. You can go crazy. There are a lot of books. And finally, if you know anyone I should interview for the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. All my contact info is at mountainandprairie.com, and I'm on all the social media stuff, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, blah, blah, blah. So feel free to reach out. I'd love to have some recommendations and suggestions of interesting people I should meet. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.